Welcome to AI Founders Mindset. This podcast dives into the stories of visionary founders and the incredible people who power the startup ecosystem. Whether you are building your own venture or simply curious about the world of startups, you are in the right place. Today's episode, the conversation with Daniel. We built 5 AI startups in under a year. If you like today's episode, please subscribe and give your like. Let's get started. 行きましょう. Okay, so Daniel, your fun fact, now I knew it. You are a super San Francisco boy, correct?
Yes, I love San Francisco. Lived here a long time, and my family is 3 generations in San Francisco.
3 generations? Okay, your grandmas are from here.
My grandfather and my grandmother met and got married here.
Amazing. My first time to see super real California, San Francisco boy. Cool. Okay, anyway, so first of all, thank you so much for attending this interview, Daniel. So, could you please tell us about yourself? What do you do in San Francisco and also Japan?
So, in San Francisco, I've been an entrepreneur. I actually did not grow up here. I really was born in Oklahoma and moved to Monterey, and then finally got to San Francisco about 20 years ago. Time flies. And so I'm an entrepreneur in the area. I'm now a venture capitalist. We've been focusing on data, artificial intelligence, energy, and really my North Star, which is planetary stability.
Okay, so the reason why I interviewed you is we met in Tokyo in September. Mm-hmm. It was Tokyo AI, and then you did presentation.
Yep, talked about artificial intelligence here in San Francisco, which is also becoming a core of our culture here, and talked about ways to think about how to build companies in the space. Right,
and then let's dive into your company, GenLab. I like this sticker. Can I show
yes,
people?
Like that, you can show them. And
yes.
When you do that, I will give you a sticker.
Oh, so sweet. You made this name or your co-founder?
So I made this name with my friend Karu Hayashi, who is the CEO of Digital Garage. And it was a brand that we built together. Digital Garage is one of our anchor investors.
I see. Okay, so our audience is so curious. What do you do, particularly GenLab is?
So GenLab is a venture studio. A little different than an accelerator, different than an incubator. We are a small venture fund that looks to find technologies that we believe that we can invest in and build out greater capability with to support the growth of artificial intelligence.
Okay, so all member at the GenLab is their background is only like investors or finance?
So we have a venture fund, but the actual studio is staffed with subject matter experts. And so we have our CTO, Sarah Novotny. She's got a great background in open source and data and cloud computing. And we have Brady Forrest, my co-founder, who's got a background in media. And then we have a group of advisors, such as Tony Agazarian or others, that are helping us build out greater capabilities. So we're actually a team of experts that take technology, see if we can dual purpose it, meaning that the technology partner may be using that technology for one vertical. Maybe they're using it for retail, but we think that technology can be used maybe in Japan, maybe for a different purpose. So we then look at that, and as a studio, we actually build the companies around the technology, find the founders, apply it, and then we try and commercialize it as fast as possible.
Interesting. Okay. For example, if I am a kind of potential founder and maybe I don't have any like CTO, So such a people can apply for your cohort or approach. What do you think?
So, as a venture studio, we definitely are trying to help inspire the community here in San Francisco. So we host hackathons and we bring our team members to that. But for the most part, we're very focused on scaling critical infrastructure. So the teams and things that we're looking at, if you have technology that you think that you want to accelerate, and if you are interested in being an entrepreneur, if you're interested in being a technologist or an engineer or any of those additional roles, we definitely are looking for those teams to come and deploy. But for the most part, the studio itself comes up with the ideas based on the partners and our technology partners.
I see. Okay, so Daniel, so I saw your history. GenLab, you guys started from January 2023, correct?
So we initially started the project as in about January 2023, but the actual fund launched this year in March.
And then already did like 2 or 3 times of hackathon, correct?
Correct.
So the reason why you guys did like 3 hackathon and conference is you wanted to find amazing talent, correct?
So we wanted to inspire talent in the area, and we wanted to bring them here to Digital Garage and to GenLab, and be able to create a exciting environment where people could showcase their ideas, build technology, and start that community that needs to be vibrant for when we grow our studio. We want to make sure that we have phenomenal talent around us. So very, very similar to what you said, yes.
I see. Cool. And then this almost 10 months, how many startups work with GenLab?
We've invested in 5 startups at this moment in time, and we're building 2 companies at this moment in time.
Many founders, they want to know what is your criteria to select the startups or potential successful scale-up startups.
It's a great question. So our thesis is that AI is converging the transportation sector, the communication sector, and the energy sector. At the same time, it's putting significant pressure on those sectors, meaning that we do not have enough energy capability to maintain the demand that artificial intelligence requires. Our transportation systems are still learning how to work with cars like Waymo or other, autonomous driving vehicles. In our communication systems, there's still places around here where 5G you're struggled to get 5G. So while we want to have AI thrive through the world, and we want to build all these autonomous vehicles, we want to build all these autonomous systems, our infrastructure is not ready for it. So if you have technology that can help scale that environment, and AI is a core component of that technology, we would want to talk to you.
I see. Interesting. So, okay, through my interview in this 1 year, actually I found the people who has great technology and then fall in love into technology, but they don't consider the end user's pain point. And then at the other side, the founder who find the pain point first of end user and then fall in love with the problem solving. I don't know, they have already technology or not yet. So which type of founders do you want to help or invest?
So I'll talk about how we approach that, because you bring a great point. Technology is both the most amazing place to invest, but it's also the scariest place to invest because of what you just talked about. You can have an amazing technology that you absolutely fall in love with, but it has no ability to market, grow, or scale. So we start in reverse. So when I talked about how we're approaching the transportation, communication, and energy sectors, what we're looking for is gaps that we know exist there. We want to make sure those gaps have at least $100 million of service obtainable market. The TAM should be north of $1 billion, if not in the tens of billions. And then from understanding that pain point, we start breaking down what's required to actually build out that capability. So we're looking for technologists that have a technology where they already know that there's a demand. We already know that that technology can solve for one of those large challenges, which is significant growth right now. For example, if you look at how much we're going to be investing in the energy space over the next couple of years, we're looking at a $630 billion investment globally in that space. So that's a massive market opportunity. So we're looking for people who know that their technology can solve for one of those challenges that have a significant market availability.
I love that. Yes. So there are specialists from the AI, but like we need to have a conversation from many aspects, maybe cybersecurity or I don't know, like AI governance. Like we had better to think many risks. Like if we use this for like energy system, and then maybe such a good I don't know, universe or like amazing future or kind of super hell, super destroyed future. So we have to like predict and then have to conversation. So I love it. So I assume next year you guys will do next conference or something event. I would love to attend and then listening to expert conversation talk.
So you brought up a lot in that I think is really important to talk about. You brought up AI governance. You talked about cybersecurity. You talked about how AI will affect the world. Was it going to be positive or it's going to be negative? As I mentioned earlier, my North Star is planetary stability. I think artificial intelligence is a critical piece of how we approach that. We're going to need to have capability in autonomous systems, and we're going to have need in energy capability, energy distribution, energy management. We're going to have to be able to understand that we have to build scale multiple capabilities and multiple verticals, from agriculture all the way to being able to handle large-scale supply chain, being able to move and deliver other capabilities around, let's say, how do we handle some of the environmental damage that's already been done? Can we use autonomous systems to be able to mend that? And so when I think about AI and I think about how you apply that, first and foremost, we believe trusted AI, you need to have a trusted AI methodology as you build. Cybersecurity is paramount because everything is connected. So AI and autonomous systems are really just the physical manifestation of artificial intelligence. And when we look at that, we realize that if you don't start day one with cybersecurity, or if you don't start day one with trusted AI, you're also potentially creating an environment that can be used maliciously, either by hacking it, denying it, or in other ways manipulating it in a way that is not for its intended purpose. So you have to build that day one, especially if you're working in highly regulated markets such as energy and transportation and communication. And so those are foundational to the studio, and they're foundational to any project that we look at.
How about your observation of Japan?
Japan also loves technology. Yes. And I love when I'm in Shibuya or, when I'm in Tokyo, you can see the love of just in the lights, the energy. There are a lot of technology gadgets that you can get in Japan that aren't here, right? And so Japan is very forward in that. And so, and you have Sakana AI, I think, I know Microsoft is making a lot of investments in the area, same with Google. So I think Japan is going to learn how to perfect AI And I think that what I get excited about it is in the autonomous system space, because I got to drive. I was heading on down to Yokosuka.
Yeah, it's a Kanagawa prefecture.
Yeah.
They have an American base, right?
But when I drove down there, you can see the incredible landscape of Japanese industry, and you can see it is I've never seen anything like it, and it's the scale and capability that Japan has to build, to automate, perfect. I think is a place that I think we're going to see Japan really shine in the next decade, because I think that we're going to need that globally. We're going to need that capability globally, and I think Japan knows how to do that better than almost anyone else.
I'm so curious. So you are a super entrepreneur. From 18 years old, you started to your business, correct?
I've started my first company when I was 18. It was a graphic design company.
Really? Okay. Why did you start this, your design studio?
Well, I was an art major, so I'm an illustration major. And the Apple Power PC had just come out. And
It was Lisa.
no, not Lisa. I'm not that old. But the Power PC had came out. It was the 6800, and you could finally afford a computer that you could do real graphic design on. And so because of that, we were starting to do digital publishing back in 1993, 4-ish. And that's how I got also involved in computers, and then I started getting involved in larger computers. But it was my spirit of wanting to create that got me into really being able to become a technologist. And then because of that, I had to learn how to program, I had to learn how to network, I had to learn infrastructure, I had to learn how to secure it. But it was that spirit that was able to carry me along the way.
I see. Super impressive. Many young people, including me, who love drawing or like designing someone's like CD jacket at the time, right? And then we don't go to like learning, programming, or business, but you did kind of comprehensive to establish and improve your business, correct?
Correct. And I still try and keep my North Star as something that inspires me to build what I build.
Okay, yeah, this is a great tips. We don't want to, no, we should not, what can I say, feel, I accomplished. No, we have to keep updating. Especially nowadays, there are many like online courses, so we had better to update consistently. This is good to like be a kind of having a good antenna to come up with new idea or collaborate with other experts. This is what I learned from you today.
ありがとうございます。
So, sorry, last question. So, why you have a kind of good connection and you have some close people in Japan?
Why do I have such close people in Japan? Because I got to meet my friend Hayashi-san from Digital Garage about 15 years ago. And I started working for him here in San Francisco, building up a company, or as an investor, building up a company. I came to Japan and I was inspired by it. But you know what is interesting? We are very impressionable when we were young. And my grandmother went to Japan in 1920.
What?
And she came home with a lot of Japanese art and Japanese prints. And so I grew up around Japanese art my entire life. And so it's, I keep going back to that spirit thing. Once you have something in your mind is very powerful. And so I think that helped me appreciate Japan when I came there even more. And then, I think that's the beauty, the temples, the, Mount Fuji itself is always, you never get, no matter what, you never get tired of seeing Mount Fuji. Every single time you see it, it sort of inspires you. It humbles you, right? But also inspires you. And the entire countryside of Japan is also so beautiful. And so I think that, and then I was befriended by many Japanese. And so I would say that, as I said, I look forward every time I go there. I'm always excited to be there.
Tell us about your next milestone in the next 1 year.
So our next milestone will be launching 2 companies next year. And so we're on track to do that. In the meantime, we are looking at technology that we can use for the studio. And if we find technology that we like, we do a small investment in that technology. And then we partner with them to adapt that for a larger scale implementation, such as if it's the US, onboarding into Japan, or onboarding into Europe, or building capability that needs to be done to support the growth of artificial intelligence.
Thank you so much. How about your private?
My private?
Next milestone.
That would probably be spend more time appreciating art, spend more time appreciating my friends and my family, and just trying to, take in the beauty around me.
Thank you so much. It's amazing. Okay, so I cannot stop question, but maybe next year we can do part 2. Thank you so much for attending today.
ありがとうございました。
ありがとうございました。バイバイ。The 3 key takeaways from the conversation with Daniel. 1. The role of GenLab as a venture studio bridging the US and Japanese AI ecosystem. GenLab, co-founded by Daniel with backing from the Japanese VC Digital Garage, is a venture studio that combines technologies, investment, and company building. It connects the US and Japanese AI ecosystems, fostering innovation by identifying cutting-edge technologies and creating startups to solve critical challenges in energy, transportation, and communication. 2. Inspiring innovation through hackathons. GenLab organizes hackathons and community events to cultivate a vibrant AI ecosystem in San Francisco. Those gatherings attract technologists, engineers, and entrepreneurs, providing a platform to collaborate, develop innovative solutions, and scale impactful technologies. 3. The journey of lifelong learning. Daniel started his career as an illustrator, but never stopped to learning and updating his skills. His passion for growth and innovation led him to become a founder of a venture studio focusing on artificial intelligence, bridging art, technologies, and entrepreneurship to create impactful solutions for the future. I really love it. Yeah, I can't forget how he gave a talk about his next milestone to enjoy art and also GenLab in San Francisco to be a bridge between Japan and San Francisco. I really love to hear more about it. Anyway, thank you so much for listening our podcast today. We hope our episode will help your future and career. Okay, bye bye. またね。